Good morning, Gen Lead. I'm your host, Ashreya, and today we bring to you Dr. Prasad Kaipa of Kaipa Group. Thank you for joining us. Before we hear from Dr. Kaipa on his perspectives of leadership, let's get to know a bit about his background. Dr. Prasad Kaipa is the CEO of Kaipa Group, an establishment dedicated towards promoting innovation and leadership amongst corporate bodies. He's also the co-author of From Start to Wise, Acting and Leading with Wisdom, which has been endorsed by leading professionals in the field. Dr. Kaipa claims his inherent purpose to be to ignite the genius within any entity he works with, on scales ranging from a sole individual to a multinational corporation. He graduated from the Indian Institute of Technology with his PhD in physics, from which point he progressed to working with Apple, eventually arriving at his essential purpose of coaching a dedicated means towards promoting and evoking true genius. Dr. Kaipa's traverse in the professional industry has encompassed a multitude of facets, including the scientific field, broadly speaking, which he studied and applied through the beginning of his career, eventually transforming into applied technological environments, including understanding the inherent nature of technology and its workings within. Furthering this, he went on to observe the patterns of learning in the public function, so as to come to a clear central point of understanding learning as a process, and promulgating the idea of creating, further enhancing, and further innovating through the means of achieving true genius. In Dr. Kaipa's words, igniting the genius within occurs in the gap between learning and performing. In 2002, following his work in Silicon Valley, he became involved with an at-the-time budding entrepreneur institute, essentially functioning as a primary means to fulfill the purpose he had established as igniting the genius within. TIE, the Indus Entrepreneurs, serves as a network of entrepreneurs and serves thousands of members today, stating its 4 pillars of establishment to be networking, education, funding, and incubating. It also serves as an excellent resource for startups and youth to look to when setting up their own corporate structures for success. Following his work with TIE, though, Dr. Kaipa began his work with the Indian School of Business in Hyderabad as a visiting professor in the Executive Education Division. It was there that he worked with thematic concepts such as leadership, its facets, and its tenets. From science to technology to leadership, Dr. Prasad Kaipa has done it all. We are delighted to have him here with us on Generation Leaders today. We are sure his messages to the future generation of leaders will be priceless. So, Dr. Kaipa, let's begin the conversation. What is your definition of leadership? Does it encompass having core values, conceptualizing an overarching vision, or setting short-term specific goals?
What you just demonstrated is an example of leadership. You didn't take what I have, you researched, you tried to look at how what I am doing could be framed in the context of your listeners and your audience. And you told the story by reframing what I have done in a way that can capture the imagination of your audience. Essentially, my definition of leadership consists of some of those. Number 1, stepping up, not necessarily having an authority or support of the top management, but taking a role that you feel you can provide certain leadership, you can take some higher level of responsibility, which might mean providing certain guidance, certain vision, certain role modeling to get the job done. So there is of course, when you talk about leadership, there is personal leadership context, that is leading oneself through certain values, through purpose and through vision towards where one wants to end up. Second is leading other people, but in both cases, the idea of a vision, idea of larger purpose, which includes certain amount of values, and inspiring and motivating other people to get the job done, and in the process developing them as leaders are some of the elements of being a leader in the 21st century.
Excellent. Okay, wonderful for us to hear that as a future generation, trying to go for an overarching definition where we can encompass each of these values as leaders. Okay, awesome. So from your experience, How would you define leadership in terms of existing theories, in terms of like laissez-faire versus democratic leadership or autocratic leadership? How would you preferentially demonstrate that?
My sense is leadership without core values, as Peter Drucker put it, is more of a misleadership rather than true leadership. At some level, vision is great, and because vision connects and inspires people. But then comes the question of bridging the gap between vision and the current reality. That's where the cognitive connection, that's where the continuous followership begins to come about. So in that respect, I believe with respect to existing models of leadership, like for example, even the Medtronic CEO, Bill George, who teaches in Harvard, he talks about authentic leadership, right? And one of the key parts about democratic versus autocratic, authentic, transformational, if you look at all of that, ultimately it comes down to a purpose that links values and vision and guides people to step up and take leadership in wherever they are. It's not about doing the things. It's not about structuring stuff. That is what we call management. But it is about seeing the opportunity to provide guidance and taking that opportunity to do what it takes. I think that's what I believe the future generation and your generation is beginning to take a lot more. You are not willing to just say yes to what Generation X or baby boomers have done. You are saying, I want what I want, plus what I want needs to make a bigger difference to other people. I believe you are balancing certain amounts of individual, your own way of thinking. If you want to put it as autocratic, I think it would be too radical, but at some level, you do want to stand up for what you believe in, and no matter whether anybody else is coming with you or not, you want to go your path. That is where you integrate some of the values of autocratic leadership. But many times you guys are very good with the social media, with various things that are coming up, where you know how to get the likes, for the lack of a better word, to be able to get other people to carry your message forward. That is what we call sharing your post to other people. So in that respect, the idea of combining certain democratic leadership values with certain fearlessness about following what your agenda is, what you believe that needs to be done, I think that balance is where I believe the future needs to be. And that is where I think most leadership theories which you hear in the classroom comes alive with the generation like yours.
Excellent. So we're trying to go for, in your words, a type of leadership whereby we have a firm stance being asserted, but also having that individuality to the point where the team is being supported in as much of a democratic fashion as possible.
Right. And especially in doing that, if you can be open to listen to other people's ideas and recognize where you might be going wrong, or where what you are trying to do may not be getting you what you want. If you can be willing to make a course correction, that shows your democratic nature of leadership. But when you are willing to stand for what you believe in, the values, the vision and clarity, then that is the autocratic part of the leadership.
Okay. So that leads me into another facet. When we're trying to envision how we as individuals would assert ourselves, or would, on the other flip side, try to allow for team involvement or team engagement, how does this balance correlate with emotional intelligence? And what is emotional intelligence in leadership, in your opinion?
My sense is that as you just articulated, if you have to take a stand firmly, and if you have to be willing to listen to people's opinions, it does require significant amount of emotional intelligence. I think Daniel Goleman had put it quite nicely that emotional intelligence has got some self component and some relationship component. It is the ability to have both self-awareness and self-control, as well as the contextual awareness and certain amount of ability to deal with whatever needs to be done. So in that respect, I do believe emotional intelligence is core to leadership, because management may be structures, processes, systems, and getting the projects done, but leadership is more about leading people rather than leading structures and processes. So without having appropriate emotional intelligence, neither you can develop followers nor you can develop them as leaders, let alone connect with them at a deeper level to understand what you stand for.
Okay, and while we're discussing having a balance in the team, we've also got to acknowledge the balance of providing information and withholding information. And this kind of ties into a theme of being an authentic leader. So Mark Ecko once noted that authenticity is equal to what you say, times what you do, times your capacity for change, times your emotional impact, the power of the vision for the future, which is a very heavily packed formula, which to decompose might take hours or decades even. But what is the role that authenticity plays within being an effective and communicative leader?
Let's look at it in this way. President Trump is a very authentic leader. But the poll numbers say that authenticity is not what people are looking for. So, at the same time, Hillary Clinton, people questioned about her authenticity because of her being a policy wonk, heavily prepared. She was really trying to look at what needs to be done, and sometimes it is difficult to say how much of it is deeply believed in oneself versus what she is doing. And there are lots of Saturday Night Live's examples of both of them. Like when I wrote the book From Smart to Wise, I looked at authenticity as an extraordinarily important part, but at the same time, knowing when to be authentic, when to be appropriate, is one of the wise leader characteristic. So if we just, tag ourselves to be authentic, then I believe we get into a scenario where we are only looking at what I say, what I do, whether I can change, what is the emotional impact, what is my vision, as we are seeing with the Trump, with his, what you call seat of the pants approach, instinctive way of doing it, and policy making by tweets, or, today I'm for Russia, tomorrow I'm different. Not NATO is obsolete. No, it is NATO is no longer obsolete. So what it means is your ability to provide leadership cannot be just based on your authenticity alone, because what you consider authentic does not necessarily manifest in your leadership unless you have an emotional maturity and you have a certain other capabilities that are necessary for leadership.
Okay, so would you say that authenticity is a relative measure then within a corporate structure or political structure as we're observing it today?
I would say I do not know whether I should put it as a relative measure or an absolute measure, but I would put it as one of very important elements. Without authenticity, there is no charisma, there is no connection. So I'm talking about going beyond the emotional intelligence here. I'm talking about executive presence. I'm talking about charisma. I'm talking about who you are and what you stand for as a person at some level is connected with three things. I would go beyond what some of the people said, like whether it is Mark Ecko or somebody else, like saying There are three gaps I see, and I would call them integrity gaps rather than authenticity gaps. The first one may be authenticity, like what you say versus what you do. As a leader, like in business schools, we look at leadership as a behavior characteristic rather than a cognitive characteristic. So that means what you do gets observed a lot more, whether you are a teen or whether you are a middle-aged or whether you are a senior leader. So what you do has to match what you say, because most people may not hear what you say, but they can very clearly see what you do. So I would say the gap between what you do and then what you say, that is the first gap. I call it obviously the credibility gap. Without that credibility, there is no authenticity. The second gap I call between what you feel and think and what you do. I need to be able to say, I respectfully disagree. Let's talk it out. Where do I agree? Where do I disagree? Let's go one level deeper. If you don't have the courage to have that dialogue and disagreement with somebody else, you might take it as an element of authenticity. I call it a commitment gap. What does it mean? I'm only committed to myself. I'm not actually committed to you in this relationship to give you feedback, to develop you, or to help you. If something you are asking or something you are saying, if I do not connect with it, I need to be able to engage with you. I think most of the leaders and managers these days, they can't give one-on-one feedback. They always tell somebody else than developing each other. Whether you are a manager, whether you are a individual contributor, whether you are a professor. That is the second gap I call it. And the third gap I call being-doing gap. Like who I am versus what I do. That is something, it's an extraordinarily important. Of course, people ask, what is this being? In a philosophical sense, there may be a lot more that can be told in the spiritual context, but the being is like your presence. Like I am showing up to you the same way I show up somewhere else, I believe. But because we have been having this conversation for 15 minutes or plus, you have a sense of who I am. In your own mind, you have an image of who I am. So that means it doesn't matter what I try to cover up and what fancy language I use or what kind of models or examples I talk about, the essence of who I am comes through for each of us. That's what, again, that connects to authenticity by saying you are just being polite versus you are being true to yourself. I think that is another, if I put it in a funny way, I can call Prasad keeps on prasading. Wherever I go, whatever I do. So that means I can be a Prasad, a professor, Prasad, the executive coach, Prasad, a father or a friend, but there is a true nature of who I am, how I speak, what I stand for, comes through, not based on what I say, but based on what you examine my life. I think if I am not courageous enough to do what I truly believe in, I think that is the deepest level of authenticity, and that is when I struggle. Like I was working as a professor of physics at University of Utah. I had opportunity to work with a couple of people who ended up getting Nobel Prize. So it was a great opportunity, but somewhere I felt I connected a lot more with the technology and people, not just with the sciences that I have spent large amount of time preparing, teaching, and I was good at what I was doing, except that somewhere I was not being authentic to myself. So summarizing it, there are three gaps I'm talking about. What you say and what you do, that I call credibility gap. What you think and feel and what you do, that I call commitment gap, that is commitment to other people. And ultimately, commitment to myself is being and doing gap, that I call courage gap. So credibility plus commitment plus courage gives you the leadership character. So if you want to use that equation, that may be talking about the three gaps that I call integrity. Leadership integrity, leadership character develops through these, and I hope it makes sense to you, especially because your generation can relate to these things much more, and it may be a lot easier for you to put it in practice than complex equations.
There we go. We just heard our new formula of leadership for the next generation of leaders. And as I'd like to go into a little bit more depth in terms of your observation of the gaps, one thing that I have noted in terms of my research is that Karl Marx noted that there are 4 detrimental facets of alienation that are similar to what you're noting, although yours are a little bit more, contracted in terms of their scope. So what Karl Marx had noted was that there are 4 detrimental facets, namely being worker to their work alienation, the worker to the production alienation, the worker to themselves alienation, which you noted, and the worker to the social process alienation. Would you highlight one of these as overall very detrimental, or would you say that each of these plays an equal role in diminishing an organization? And which way do you think that leadership really makes an impact in terms of the leaders being the ones to ensure that these are not being instituted, or the constituents of the leadership themselves trying to work against these processes?
I think I would say probably Karl Marx context of alienation is much more than Adam Smith's way of production, because we are essentially in the knowledge age. Whether I do agriculture or whether I do media, whether I teach, whether I create a product through manufacturing process, I think we are all knowledge workers. That is pretty clear these days. From that context, if you talk about engagement, worker motivation, and innovation. So if you talk about all of those, I would say to a certain extent, 2 things may be more important. One is worker to self alienation, which is, I talked about 3 gaps in that context. Worker to work alienation, because leader is not providing the connect to that. Like, people need meaning, people need purpose, and people need connection so that they can be passionate about the work that they do. So all the 3 of them are interconnected, as you can see. If you don't have a passion, you're not curious, you don't even want to engage. And if people are not creating certain kinds of motivating or helping you to reflect on some things or developing yourself, it doesn't happen. So at some level, I would say worker to work and worker to self are much, much more important. That's the reason why many of the organizations these days don't just talk about the vision, they talk about the larger purpose. Look at the scenario just that happened this week at the United Airlines, how, they are right, probably legally, if you try to narrowly interpret it as, you're accommodating certain number of seats. But that's a contract they wrote. Passenger didn't have any voice in it. Second, nobody told them not to have that engagement while people are still waiting to get on the plane. Number 3, even after that, if somebody is not willing to do, they could have increased the compensation. That would have attracted a few more people to drop off. They didn't do that. And then even if they were to take a person, they didn't need to take a person who is bloodied to be, dragged off of a plane. And then comes the question, the work alienation. The CEO of United went through 3 levels. First he said, oh, my people did what needed to be done. Then he said, oh, maybe there was a problem. Then he came up with an apology. In the process, he lost how many millions, how many hundreds of millions of dollars of United value has been depreciated in the process of it. And so what it means is, in the 21st century, the whole idea of the communism, as Karl Marx looked at, on the whole, is being completely restructured with a certain amount of capitalistic perspective and a communal way of connecting with other people through media, through social media, through all of this type of stuff. It requires us to re-examine what leadership is, who the constituents are, and how an organization has to create a social contract in addition to the legal contract. Then the idea of what is ethical in a what you might call industrial context is no longer appropriate in the knowledge worker context. And all of that comes down to people like you who are youth, people who are savvy with the technology, savvy with the social media, not willing to stand for what you consider as inappropriate or undemocratic or unethical or not appropriate values. When you have a question, the way in which you guys are using the media, if the video were not to be on, has not gone viral, the conversation United would be having would be very, very different today with Dr. Doe. So I think each of us have a role to play, and each of us, no matter who is alienating whom in workplace, when we stand up for I am connected, I am responsible. Nobody might have asked me to become a leader, but when I do what I do because my conscience tells me, I see the opportunity. When you stand up for that, I think you are bringing leadership where leadership didn't exist. So in that respect, the person who put the video out of the United is truly a leader who is maybe unintentionally is going to transform large number of employee rights versus airline rights versus passenger rights. I think all of them will be redone. That one incident will disrupt the relationship between the airline and the passenger. So in that respect, they did a major leaderful act, whether they intentionally meant to do it or not. So that's what I think is the world that we live in. Each of us have an opportunity to lead when we are least expecting. But if you sit with an alienation feeling, then you are being a victim. That means being victim of somebody else's leadership instead of stepping into your own leadership and taking every moment as an opportunity for you to be such a leader.
Yes, definitely. That was a very shocking incident, and definitely the way you put it into context is very helpful to observe the nuances of leadership, which may not have been priorly caught in terms of this sort of context. So within the context of what did happen, and outside of that as well, when we're trying to go into having a central governing body, trying to have a say, versus having this sort of like starfish theorem where we have different branches having their own leaders, do you think that there's more of a say in that sort of structure, or do you feel as though having the central governing body has more benefit to it?
My sense is it depends on the context again. See, it becomes again the role of government versus role of the individual to make a decision. Center versus state. Or in a company, you talk about the headquarters versus SBU. So it all comes down to balancing the polarities. There is no one right model that what works for government and that works for state or central government if you want to stay within the government region, or in a company, or in a country, or for the generation. I think we are, if I were to really summarize where we are, number one, we are in a flux. Number two, the VUCA world, which people talk about, the velocity, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity that we face are only going to accelerate rather than reduce. That means the polarities like what you are setting up, central government versus something else. If you try to talk about that kind of polarities, the key is to recognize, frame yourself objectively, looking at what are the advantage of one system by proper attention being paid to the shadow side of that system as well. Because everything, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. So look at it and say, where does the model of central government system break down? And try to see how many contexts that breakdown will affect you and affect other people. And try to reduce that impact. So another way of saying is, you have to be wise about not necessarily taking a position on what is right and defending it till the end. Start with the assumption what is right because you believe it or emotionally you feel connected to it, but stay open to listening to the other side argument and be willing to look for where the difference can be made in the longer run as well as in the shorter run. And the best way you can bridge this or to be able to resolve this polarity is take some steps fast, be willing to fail, apologize and start again. So that is the way it connects back to entrepreneurship. It is about, like I think Wayne Gretzky is attributed to this quote, 100% of the shots you don't take never make it to the goal. So the idea of leadership, again coming back to the basic sense that leadership is a behavior, if I were to be saying what you should do, in your generation needs to take steps, stand firm, be open, see the opportunity in polarity, see the opportunity in crisis, and become clear as you take the steps. Not necessarily wait till you become clear, or you just go with like a bull in a china shop. Neither one will work. You have to be able to take some steps, stand and reflect, take some steps, unlearn, and then move on. I think that context of unlearning and relearning to become an effective leader is probably the way in which I think your millennial leadership is going to teach a lot of us who are older and who are a little bit more, what you might call stuck in our own positions. So ultimately it comes down to, if I were to say, learning leadership and, being wiser rather than smarter is probably the best way to do. And you don't need my definition, you don't need to read my book on wise leadership, but if you sit and think for a few minutes, ultimately leadership comes down to three things, right? Decide, how do you act, how do you communicate? And sometimes we know how to make decisions, but we hesitate to act. We act, but if somebody asks us to justify and communicate, we falter. So the idea is that ultimately you are about one of the three. Now, in each of them, let us say tomorrow you have a great decision to be made or action to be taken. Think about it and say, what is the smarter decision versus a wiser decision? Smarter action versus a wiser action. Smarter communication versus wiser communication that has more emotional intelligence. If you take each day one decision, action or communication to move towards wiser, in 30 days, I promise you, you will be a much better leader with a much higher impact on the world than who you would be today. And that doesn't require somebody else role modeling, but it takes some amount of time to unlearn, stay open, and re-examine what is the wiser decision. And very short period of time, you will have enough experience of your own to be an extraordinary leader. And I believe that you guys don't have as much baggage, so the millennials can lead us to where we may not be able to lead. Either baby boomers or Gen X may not be able to go as far as you guys can do. So I have a lot of faith and hope in the younger generation.
Thank you so much. We definitely appreciate that, and we hope to be able to live up to your expectations. Now, when you're discussing the decisiveness, the action, and the communication, do you
Action.
believe that that is a bus linear sort of fashion, or do you think it's a circle? Because as I'm seeing it, decisiveness, then action, then communication. Obviously, a decision can lead to an action, can lead to a communication. But a communication from that perspective can also either determine whether we go back into making another decision or not. So how do you feel that is?
I do believe it is not linear. These are cyclical, if you want to call even helical. They keep going up. The idea is that each of them are interdependent. These three are like a, just like one, if you communicate effectively, your decision becomes clearer. And then if your decision is clear, action doesn't have as many barriers in our subconscious and unconscious. So a positive spiral can be continuing to bring clarity, continuing to engage with other people and communicating so that more number of people are inspired and connected with you. And that makes the decision to be easier. But also you need to watch out, if more number of people are supportive of your decision, you need to examine, am I going by the mass opinion that could still be wrong? So I think the shadow parts of it will help you a lot more than just the bright parts. So if you are willing to unlearn what you have learned, I had a concept which I talk about called core incompetence. Like everybody talks about core competence. I look at it and say your signature strength that got you to be where you are is the one that you need to really watch like a hawk, because that's the one that will take you down the garden path. So what got you here is probably the one that will not get you where you want to go next. So the strength of today may become the weakness of tomorrow. So you are right, the decisiveness, the actionability and communication effectiveness, they can either build on each other or they can also take you down the garden path. You just have to watch that. That's the reason why I created a differentiation between smarter, that means using your intelligence for self-benefit. Wiser means using your intelligence towards a larger purpose. So if you can use some simple definitions and figure out some kind of a touchstone for you, so that your values all converge towards that larger purpose, rather than something else that you have. Because without that guidance of a North Star or a noble purpose, values don't become very important. As you know, many leadership do not talk about values. They think these are two different topics. But values, leadership, without leadership are like no effective. But leadership without values is misleadership.
Yes, definitely. Definitely agreed. Okay, so where do you see the greatest level of youth contribution towards leadership? How would you encourage the youth to become involved with leadership? Because a lot of the issue that we see with the generation, the millennials, is that we're not quite willing to step up to the challenge of being the leaders. Whereas we have the skill sets, it's the application that seems to be an issue. So how do you encourage that?
What I would start with for youth is, what are you passionate about? What gives you meaning? What moves you? Like I talk about touching, moving and inspiring. If you pay attention to your emotions and feelings, as you know, they are two different things. Emotions are what are raw, energy that moves in you, that get directed, cognitively reframed, become feelings. So it's like the notes of the music versus the music that moves you are the emotions and feelings. You need to pay attention to that. I think if you start with there, that means what am I most passionate about becomes a lot clearer. But passion, while it gives you energy, purpose gives you the direction. Ask yourself a question, why do I want to do that? Is it for a selfish reason? Is it for ego gratification? Is it for looking good? Is it for making a difference? Is it for, uh, clarifying and, making a vision come alive? If you can get those things clearer, first the passion, ask the question about purpose. If the purpose is not clear, look at meaning. Meaning is very different from understanding, as you know. So there is something that gives you meaning and passion. I would say that is the direction youth might want to go a little farther. But you want to keep asking the question, where am I going? Why am I going there? If you can ask why a few times, the mission and the purpose behind your energy becomes clearer and clearer. In the process of moving there, you will get vision. See, vision is what am I going to do? But that vision alone is not sufficient anymore for the younger generation like you. You need to have a purpose of why that vision is important. That's where the values come together with the vision. Then you can articulate the strategy, or you can come up with the tactics. You guys will do a fantastic job about that. I have no questions about it. But maybe our generation focuses more on the security, more on the fear, more on stability, rather than mission, passion, making a difference, innovation. So I think if you can balance your rebelliousness towards the older generation by clarifying what difference you want to make, why is that you are so passionate about it, what kind of a meaning that you get by following that, if you can articulate that, and if you can make decisions around that, and if you can make sure your actions are aligned with that, then chances are, like what I talked about earlier, integrity, that integrity will become the biggest strength that will stand by you when nobody else is able to understand you, nobody else is willing to walk the path with you or give you the opportunity. But at least you can sleep tight and you can sleep well. And next morning you can wake up and say, when I'm most confused, I will go after where I have energy and what gives me a larger purpose. Those are the guidance kind of directions that you might want to take. Then the difference you make will be much larger, because you are respecting what we have taught or our next generation has taught, but you are not willing to stop by our learnings and living our life through you, but you are able to transcend and include the fears and concerns and security areas of your parents, but lead us to a place where we didn't even think that it is possible for us to go. I think that responsibility is in your hands. Don't stop where we stopped. Don't let us prevent your risk-taking based on what we think is rational, logical, or reasonable, or achievable. You can achieve a lot more. You have a lot more genius that has not been ignited yet, and only it takes you to ignite it. So listen to us, but stretch us. That's what I would say.
Excellent. So once again, we get back to that central core concept of Dr. Kaipa's Ignite the Genius Within. Hear, hear, future leaders. Also, hear, hear, mathematicians. We have an XYZ geometric plane laid out here of credibility, authenticity, and the mission that we're essentially working towards. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Kaipa. We've tremendously enjoyed having this opportunity to speak with you, and we are grateful for your contributions towards the future generation of leaders. Gen Lead, this is Ashreya signing off until next time. To hear more from us, don't forget to like and subscribe below.